Basically, I got started in Jeeps back when I was in high school. A friend of mine, we used to go mudding. I had an International Scout, and I got stuck, and he had a little old World War II Jeep, and he came over there and pulled me out, and has always made fun of me because his little old Jeep pulled me out of the mud. And so I said one day, I got to have one of those. So right as I was getting out of high school, I found an old 1945 Ford sitting on the side of the road, had a cracked block. So I started restoring it, and then I had to go off to college. I had a football scholarship, so went off to play, and it was sitting in my friend's garage, and he said, "Wayne, we got to get this thing out of here." And I called my dad, and they found a guy to put it back together for me. And I came home that summer, and it was all put back together. And that's when I first fell in love with Jeeps. Well, got married and wanted to put another Jeep back together. And I thought of this old guy that I met back when I was in college named Sam, nickname is Bud Werner, over in Tracy City, Tennessee. Well, went up there one weekend, and he gave me the tour. He had more Jeeps surplus, and then he opened up a container and said, "This is a Bantam BRC." And of course I looked at it and didn't think a whole lot about it. And he said, this is the one that developed and made the Jeep. And of course back then I didn't think a whole lot about it, but then after several years the MVCC came out. I joined the club, and I saw that picture back in the first meeting, and it had the three prototypes in it, the GP, the MA, and then a BRC. And since then I think most of those guys are gone. But I said that sure would be neat to own all three of those one day. And didn't think, I said, well, I'll probably never ever be able to do that. I'll never find these vehicles. So I found an MA back in the middle 80s and bought it. And it took me to about 1996 to finish getting it restored. And then going over to Bud Werner's in Tracy City all the time, he'd let me buy some parts from him, or we'd trade out for things. And I said, "Bud, let me put one of those BRCs together." Well, after about 3 years, he let me have all three unrestored ones that he had. Now, Bud did have an original four-wheel steer, all original, that is probably going to be in a museum one day. And then he let me buy his other four-wheel steer also that I bought, and I kept it for years, and then I sold it at the 1996 convention in Memphis, which I wish I never had. But it was one of those things I could never keep it running. And of course Bud puts these things away in these containers, and they sit, and then condensation gets on them. I couldn't shift the four-wheel drive levers. They had just frozen shut. But this thing was a time capsule that Bud came across. So anyway, I sold it, and I think till this day, I think Terry has ended up with that Jeep. But out of these three that Bud let me have, I put one of them together for Bud, which is up in his museum, I believe, in Ford Economy up in Ohio. At the time when I put it together, there was very little information about these things, and I know it's not a great restoration, but Bud didn't really care. I told Bud, "Look, I'll get it together, put it with what parts we have, but it's not going to be judged and win any awards." But that's all we knew back then when we put this thing together, because this was before all the other people had really gotten involved with it. So I put it together, and I had two residue left over that I was going to put one of them together. And then I tried to get my friend Bruce Lynch, "Here, why don't you take this other one?" Because when we were pulling it out of Bud's garage, it was leaning up on top of this other Jeep. And I said, "Bud, that thing's bent in half." He says, "Oh yeah, that one's rusted right in the middle. You know, they're all bad about rusting." And I said, "How are we going to get that thing out of here in one piece?" So we got it out of there. But anyway, that was a Jeep that was driving around kind of like this on four wheels. It was bent in the middle. Well, after I got all the parts I needed off of it, a fella called me and asked me if I'd sell one of them, and I cleared it with Bud and said, look, I could use this to help restore these things, and he said that's fine. So we let him have it with the understanding that he would not sell it. Well, that didn't end up to be true. So anyway, learned a good lesson there. But I started putting this Bantam I got from Bud together about 5 years ago. Well, and Bruce Lynch had his. We just said, look, let's let Jim finish putting these things together, because this guy is as good as Duncan is knowing what to do and how to put these things together correctly, because if you're going to do these things, you might as well do them right. So we, I think Jim's had it up there about a year, and it's about ready for us to pick up. And I'll tell you, Jim is a master at these things, along with Duncan. They both do great jobs of restoration. They're both meticulous in what they do and pay attention to all the detail. So Bruce and I know when we get them back, we'll certainly be proud of them. And so that's kind of how it's gone so far. And then in the meantime, a GP came up between the deals, and I said, if I get that GP, I'll have all three of them. So I've got all three prototypes. The GP I have not restored because it is a pretty much original time capsule. Somebody made a bench seat across it, but it's not a rusty vehicle, and I just don't know what to do with it. I just really don't want to restore it. But on the other hand, I don't like it painted metallic green either, but that's neither here nor there now. But that may be another project down the road, just to detail it out. Well, as we all know, there's so much debate about who developed the Jeep. Personally, my opinion is I feel Bantam was very significant in presenting this to the military, and I feel that they're the ones that basically designed it, and everybody did their prototypes off of it. And I just felt like you feel sorry for Bantam in one way, but you can understand the government's point of view on another, because they had to have big manufacturing facilities to produce them. But I personally feel Bantam is the creator of the Jeep, and the Bantam Car Company, and it's my personal opinion. I'm sure I will be debated by many Willys people out there, but that's for another day and another conversation. But I think when it's all said and done, the facts will show it. The plans with my three prototypes, of course, I'd love to have a building and do that with them. Of course, you know, gathering all these prototypes now, I'm, goodness gracious, 35, 40 years down the road after starting this hobby, and it's a shame how it gets in your blood, but I love it. And it even got into the surplusing end of it. A good friend of mine that got me in it was with Southern Parts. His name was Tommy Hunt, and they were the largest half-track dealer in the world. And I used to go down there looking at all their things, and he kept trying to get me to buy a half-track, and I said, well, I don't think I can take that home and get that in my yard, because I know I'll get a lot of questions from my wife. So I just, but going through all of his parts and things, there were a lot of things that were universal to the Jeep, and he gave me good deals on buying parts. And I was back there scrounging one day, and I found 20 Bantam transfer cases, new in the crate, but just empty cases by themselves. Of course, back then, who wants Bantam transfer cases? So I sold them to Bud Werner, I think, for $25 a piece, and he may still have them. I don't know, and there were GPs in there also. It may have been an MA or two, but at the time, you know, they didn't, Bantams and MAs and GPs, they were still sitting under somebody's barn. And needless to say, how many of these things have popped up since in the last 25 years? So it's amazing, all of this that has popped up, even with the Bantam cars that keep popping up. And sure as we think that's all of them, in probably another 5 years, another 2 or 3 will pop out of the woodwork. Who knows? But it's amazing what keeps going and what keeps this hobby going. It's the thrill of the find and the thrill of the hunt also. I was in the sporting goods business, and we used to have a sporting goods show up in Chicago, and every year I'd go up there and I'd take about a half a day and go up to Berg's. And at the time, he was still in business, but you know, it was down on Wabash Street, pretty rough part of Chicago, and the building was about to fall in, but he let me come in and walk around, and I'd spend $100 in there and find some parts that I thought were neat. And then Mr. Berg, I was up there one week, and he said, "Why don't you buy all this?" And I said, "Well, what do you want for it?" And he said, "Well, give me $100,000. Well, I'd look around in there, and I tried to figure it out. Is there $100,000 worth of parts in there? Well, Berg died, and his son-in-law Jordy took over, and Jordy's job was to go ahead and liquidate it. And Jordy would call me up and offer parts to me, and I would buy them on the phone. And new old stock crash pads, I think I bought 300 of them back then, and it was just a lot of parts that they had there. And I said, "Where are all these parts when you started?" "Oh, they're all over the place." I told him the story about me wanting to buy it, and Jordy Mr. Berg trying to get me to buy it. And he said, "You should have done it. I've already tripled my money selling all these parts out of there." And I'm just sitting there, oh golly. But there's again, you know, got to haul it all away from there. But at the time, there were a lot of pictures, you know, a lot of things there. Well, anyway, he showed me around. It was a little 4-story narrow building straight up. We got on this old elevator, and I got on it with a gate that closed, and I said, "Jordy, is this thing gonna make it all the way up top?" This is kind of, "Oh yeah, it'll be fine." It was one of these old electric little elevators, but we got up to the 4th floor, and I said, "Now this is the offices right in here." So we were walking around, and I walked into Berg's office and had all these pictures on the wall. And I've got one right here that basically are a lot of them, of the Bantams and GPs that were taken by Mr. Berg. I think this was one of the first lots of surplus released by Uncle Sam in the middle to late part of the war. Years ago, I was out surplusing in a yard and came across this in some early parts. This is a new old stock Bantam BRC brake handle. Down there, what you're zoomed in on is a Bantam BRC transmission transfer case that was taken out. I found several of these years ago, and Ken Hakes ended up with a lot of them, but it is a complete unit. It'll have to be rebuilt, but I feel like these came out of an ordnance rebuild, because some of them just look like they were cut loose, or it could have come out of a surplus yard, not sure. But that's a hard item to find. That right there will stop you from putting a BRC together with all the reproduction parts. Years ago, I was at a surplus yard, and there was a mound of differentials. And I said, well, I went to the guy and said, "Look, I'd like to buy those differentials." And but the problem is, the chunks on the wrong side. I knew what they were. They were Bantams, and they were about, I would say, at least 75 to 80 of them stacked in a big pile. So I went to him and said, "Look, you know, I don't know what you can do with these things. It'll just be for parts." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. You can have every one of them for $17.50. Well, it didn't have the hub on them. The axle was out of them, but it had a lot of the steering drag links and all that still on them, where they were cut off from original Bantams. I imagine it was during a rebuild program on those during the middle of the war. Well, anyway, I got to looking at them. I said, "That's too much work. How am I going to get these out of here? I have to get a forklift." So I just left them at $17.50 a piece. And later, a European came over and bought all of them, and they've gone over to Europe now. I don't know what he paid for them, but you know, that's one of those stories. You wish you would have gotten them, but at the time, who would have ever wanted 65 front ends to a Bantam BRC?